Our Law and Justice segment tonight, an Oklahoma police officer has been acquitted in the shooting death of an unarmed black man. According to the jury foreman, police officer Betty Shelby was justified in her shooting of Terence Crutcher, but the jury did still question her decision for pulling the trigger. This is the shooting watch.
Not for taser, I think.
I've got a feeling that's about to happen.
That looks like a bad dude, too, to be honest with you.
Which way are they facing?
Police 1, they're facing westbound. I think he may have just been tasered.
Shots fired!
Ooh.
321, we have shots fired. We have one suspect down. We need IMSA here.
With me now from Americans in Support of Law Enforcement, former police officer himself, Scott Erickson. Scott, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, as always.
Scott, I want to point out, and I think this is something you and I have covered before, there are never any winners in these situations, regardless of what the courts end up finding once they've looked at the facts and determined the outcome. There's never any winners. Someone's life died. This is still a tragedy. I mean, watching that video just brings it up again. It's awful that it comes to this. But Scott, when you saw, do you agree with the verdict from this jury?
I think that we should understand that the jury was presented with more evidence and more facts in this case than any of us discussing the case could possibly know. And so with that understanding, I think we have to put faith in the jury that they made the correct decision. Also, it's important to understand that the jury had to make a decision based on not what they themselves think was personally appropriate or what they would have done and put in that situation, but what a reasonable officer would have done under the same circumstances. And I think it's also important to note that while we can second guess and question what the officer did in that particular case, I think if you were to put 10 different seasoned police officers in that same scenario, you would probably come out with 10 different reactions and responses to the same stimuli. So
right.
Does that mean that one is right or one is wrong? No, we can talk about what would be a more appropriate response or what would be a better response.
And I want to do that actually. I want to do that actually in a second. I want to talk about reforms that need to be made, but I also want to point out something. I mean, there was a lot of outcry, a lot of outrage, particularly online after this verdict was announced. But I want to point out to everyone that we actually never see the moment that Terence Crutcher is shot, the moment the officer discharges her weapon. The helicopter circles around the SUV, and that exact moment is obscured, so we don't see what he did right before. But Scott, I want you to walk us through what happened and what the proper police training, because Officer Shelby said that she reverted to what she was trained. What should happen in this situation? So she responded to the report of a stalled SUV on the highway here. The police responded. Crutcher at first approached the vehicle, but he refused to listen to officer commands. He mumbled to himself. He didn't answer. He didn't obey. At first, he had his hands up. Then Officer Shelby testified that he put his hands down. He reached into the window of his SUV, contrary to the order that she gave him not to do that. One officer discharged his taser at that time, and Officer Shelby fired her weapon. Is that proper procedure?
Again, I think every officer, given the same circumstances, may respond differently. And let me give you an example. First of all, when you think, Mr. Crutcher had PCP in his system. When you think of an individual who's under the influence of drugs and who possesses what people have called superhuman strength or is impervious to pain, for a police officer, the drug most associated with that phenomenon is PCP. Anytime an officer responds to a call where a person is suspected of being under the influence of PCP, or he or she confronts a person that they then suspect is under the influence of PCP, it's standard protocol to try and get as many officers there with you as possible before you engage or until you have to engage that person. What she confronted, from what I understand, was an individual who was walking around the middle of the roadway who she thought appeared to be under the influence of PCP. PCP influence has very specific symptoms, some of which include kind of a robotic, rigid movement, very kind of soft speech, repeating what people say to you back to you. So she's thought, based on her training and experience, that she was dealing with somebody with PCP. When that individual was not doing what she was commanding him to do, she made the decision when he reached into his vehicle to fire her weapon. Now, I think it's reasonable to assume, if you're an officer, that a person who's repeatedly refusing to obey your commands, if that person's reaching into an open vehicle, they're probably not going to be reaching for something that is safe or innocuous. You can you can reasonably assume it could be a weapon that they're
right.
they're
And I guess
reaching for.
that's my
So
question. Using your analogy of the 9 out of 10 police officers, 9 out of 10 reasonable police officers, if a suspect under the influence of drugs, especially one like PCP, if he reached into the window of his car, disobeying her command, I mean, your training teaches you that he's probably reaching for a weapon, so her reaction was not out of line here.
No, I mean, I think you have to assume that. Now, again, the moment at which you would discharge your firearm might differ from officer to officer. Some officers might see the weapon first, others, in this case, obviously she did not see a weapon because no weapon was present by my understanding. But given the same situation, another officer in the same circumstances may have gone hands-on with the suspect, perhaps by himself. Perhaps officers would have waited for backup to show up and then gone hands-on. There's so many different variables, and that's why it's such a difficult case for a jury to decide.
Well, and I think that, I mean, that's exemplified. That's exactly what happened in this situation. The officer with Officer Shelby fired his taser. He chose something different than, deadly force in that situation. I do want to play this video before we run out of time. This is the family of Terence Crutcher. They're obviously upset at the verdict, and they're calling for police reforms. Take a look.
Betty Shelby murdered my brother. And after she murdered my brother, all of the officers involved with the Tulsa Police Department tried to cover for her. What I got out of this case is that a cover-up was exposed. A cover-up was exposed. And they walked by my brother to go check on Betty Joe. In the last few breaths of my brother's life, he laid there alone.
All right, Scott, we are almost out of time, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to look at police response, police departments, or calls for reform. Is there a better way? Are there improvements that can be made to avoid the loss of life in these situations?
Look, I think better communication, obviously, between the two officers on scene. My understanding is that the officer who did the shooting didn't realize that there was a backup with her who had a taser. There's something called auditory exclusion, which people who are under high stress in extreme stressful situations experience. It's a physiological response, and it's consistent with tunnel vision. You become hyper-focused on what the threat is, the existential threat that you're facing, and you don't know what else is going on around you. So that's a very hard phenomenon for any human being to overcome. But if we can get to a point where, in this case, perhaps there was better communication so that the officer, Shelby, understood that there was a less lethal option right by her side, in those circumstances, she may not have decided to fire or discharge her weapon knowing that there was a less lethal option. Now that could change in a split second. The less lethal could be ineffective, and the officer might feel that she then had to discharge her firearm. So obviously, communication in this circumstance would have been better and helpful. But at the end of the day, like you said at the beginning of the intro, this is a tragedy, and unfortunately, sometimes tragedies are unavoidable.